Welcome, everybody, to Exercises Medicine at Drexel University. This is episode number 19, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to reconnect with a colleague who went to school with me at the University of Connecticut, Dr. David Hooper. Dr. Hooper, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, what I like to do with a lot of our podcasts really is to kind of orient the folks to our guests. So, we'll talk a little bit about some of your research and sort of what you've been able to do down at Jacksonville University and in the field of strength and conditioning, specifically within the NSCA. But I always love to start. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got into the field of exercise science and sports medicine?
Yeah, sure. So before I came on here today, I was thinking about it a lot this morning, what sort of brought me here. And I'd have to go way back to being a kid, really. And just the only thing that I ever really, truly loved was sports. I was crazy for all sports. I tried to play everything. I was always involved in sport. And I really didn't like school that much. I really didn't like school until we went to secondary school. So kind of the equivalent of high school. And for the first time, we got to pick an elective. And the elective that I got to choose was what we called physical education theory. And it was the very, very beginning of exercise science. I remember learning names of muscles, names of bones, probably the early energy system stuff. I remember learning what we called the principles of training, like specificity, progression, and overload. And for the first time ever, I liked school. And it was just an amazing feeling to truly enjoy school. I remember being excited to do my homework. It was the only subject I ever liked. And I guess that was the moment that I realized that there was going to be something there. Unfortunately, I wasn't good enough at any sports to be even close to professional standard. I was just very much a recreational standard athlete. But this was sort of my way to combine my favorite subject, physical education, and then my love of sports. And it just went from there. At that point, I decided I was going to go to college. And in England, college is different to university. So I studied what we called sports studies at college. And again, I loved it. And then went to university and studied sports conditioning and coaching was the name of my degree. Mm. And the British system is a little bit different in that we don't have a university core like we do in the United States. So all of my students at Jacksonville University, for example, they're stuck in their early years taking things like history and math and things like that. But in the British system, we didn't have to do that. All I ever did was take classes in exercise science. And again, I just loved it. And for the first time in my life, I was one of the smart kids. I was getting good grades and I just enjoyed education. I'm sorry if this is just turning into my life story here.
No, this is great.
Then I got obsessed with this idea of doing something that we called Camp America. Mm-hmm. It was an opportunity to spend a summer in the United States coaching sports camps. And I did that in the summer of 2005. And then on a fateful night in Morristown, New Jersey, at a bar called the Funky Monkey, I met a lady called Stephanie. And we started a long distance relationship because I had to go back to England at the end of the summer. And then a couple of years later, we decided my degree was done and that I was going to emigrate and that we would get married. And so I moved to the United States. At this time, I was a personal trainer and really enjoying fitness as much as ever. But I missed school. I felt like I wasn't progressing. And I really enjoyed my undergrad degree, as I explained. I loved my professors, but I was very much at a teaching university. And we didn't have a lab. We weren't ever involved in research. And again, I loved studying so much, and I would read all these research studies, and they would sound like the coolest thing. And I wanted so much to be involved in one. I wish I was conducting those studies, you know. And I read a lot of papers, and I started to recognize author names. And it seemed that my interest, the papers that I was always enjoying reading, were about strength and conditioning. And it seemed like an overwhelming majority of the papers I was reading were being authored by somebody called William J. Kramer. And then I quickly realized that he was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And I got obsessed with this guy and the research that he was doing. And when I had moved to the United States, I thought, I really want, if I'm going to go back to school, I want to do it properly. I want to go to the best school I could go to. And I would really love to study with that guy, Dr. Kramer. And I decided to, we had no money at the time, my wife and I, but I decided to fly us to a conference in Colorado Springs. It was 2008. It was the International Strength Training Conference. And the reason we went there was just because I knew Dr. Kramer was presenting there. And I got this crazy idea that if I go to this conference and I meet him and I tell him how much I want to study with him, then maybe he'll take me on as a student. And it was the craziest plan that I don't know how I ever came up with, but I came up with it and we did it and it worked. I went to see his presentation. I thought he was amazing. I spoke to him after his talk. I spoke to him again the next day and I just said, how do I make this happen? And he told me to apply and call me after I applied. And I did that, and he saw my application, and I guess took a liking to it, and told me that he would accept me. And from there on, it was just amazing. And then I got to go to the University of Connecticut, which obviously is where we met. And at the time, it was the place to be. You know, we had the best professors. You know, I went there for Dr. Kramer, but everybody there was great. You know, when I got there, I realized we've got Dr. Armstrong, who's world-renowned hydration professor. And we had Dr. Marish, who was the leader of the group. We had Dr. Casa, world-renowned in his field. And it was just this amazing collection. All the other professors were great too. Dr. DeStefano as well. I hope I didn't leave anybody out because I loved them all. And it just felt like we were somewhere really special. And they were all collaborating. And, you know, we'd help out the Armstrong students and we'd help out the Casa students, and we'd all be involved. And it was just brilliant. It was what I had dreamed of as an undergrad reading those research studies. And so, you know, I was just sort of in love with what we were doing. And I never thought twice about going into academia. It was just obviously for me. The only slight change was that as much as I loved being involved in research projects, as you know, to get a research project going, the background work that you have to do, which is basically begging people for money in some way, right? Writing grants or approaching companies, just begging people for money. I wasn't very good at that. And so I really wanted to be at a smaller institution that could do some research, that had a lab and had the ability to do some kind of low cost research, but then also have the teaching aspect, which is what I love. I really think that that's what I'm best at. I'm definitely a better teacher than I am researcher. But I like both. And so, sorry if this was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but that's ultimately how I ended up here at Jacksonville University, you know, following my passion for exercise, my love of research, my love of teaching, and it all just sort of comes together here with the position that I'm in now.
No, I love it. It was a great synopsis of your journey, which is terrific. I do, of course, I have all kinds of questions like, how did you end up in Morristown, New Jersey? How, of course, you're highlighting working with, you know, the legend, Dr. Bill Kramer, who, you know, I call, and I think a lot of people would probably call the godfather of strength and conditioning. And just what really stands out that I think, you know, students both from Jacksonville University here at Drexel and anybody else from afar that's watching this, is you really just laid out the framework of having an idea, a goal, aligning yourself with that goal, and then making it happen all the way through. And really, I think what comes to mind is you and your wife decided that, hey, if I'm going to have any chance to pursue this field that I really want and I feel passionately, this is the thing for me. You took a chance, right? You took the risk, you paid out of your own pocket, you went to Colorado Springs, you met Dr. Kramer, you introduced yourself, right? You networked and you took a chance, right? And it really worked out in your favor. And I feel that for a lot of people, that is something that is a common thread for how you go about creating an opportunity when one isn't necessarily presenting itself to you right in front of your face. And it's really a lesson that I think a lot of people can get a lot of value out of that you've presented here, which is amazing.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot with my students. If a student were to apply for a graduate program, for example, they might think that they might be really proud of what they've done. Maybe they've got a 4.0 GPA, something like that. And they're really proud of their successes. Mm-hmm. And you got to try to say this without sounding insensitive. But if you send that application to a professor, unfortunately, they're probably not going to be overly impressed, just because they see these sorts of applications all the time. You know, you're not the only student with a 4.0. And these are, if you want to study with a leader in the field, they've seen 1,000 of these applications. Dr. Kramer would see hundreds of them every year. So you have to come up with a way to stand out. And again, I don't know where I got the idea from that I should go to this conference and speak to him. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. Nobody told me that it was. I just sort of came up with it. And it isn't going to work for everybody, but it was just very fortuitous for me, because Dr. Kramer wouldn't look at a ton of his applications. He would allow his students to kind of self-select. He would wait for those ones that would come to him at a conference and show how keen they were, because he wasn't necessarily looking for genius. He was just looking for people that appreciated what he did, that wanted to study with him, that wanted to work hard, that was full of initiative. And I'm just so fortunate that my idea fit perfectly with what he was looking for. And it worked, and that got me in with him. So I encourage students to do this all the time, not just send an application, but make a personal connection with them. Go visit them wherever it is. And I know money's tight. You know, I was a poor student too, and I'm really frugal as well. So I don't throw money around. But you know, I was also very fortunate to have a supportive wife who was willing to sacrifice her vacations for years. All of our vacations as husband and wife were to conferences. Wherever the NSCA or ACSM conference was, that was our vacation that year. And thankfully she was so supportive and got us through it. But that's how you make it happen, with a ton of sacrifice and just constant persistence.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many nuggets of just the importance of having, you know, someone in your life, if you have a partner who is on board and is really committed to making you achieve that goal. It's just awesome.
Yeah, or your parents or your friends, but yeah.
Absolutely. Parents, you know, I have stories where when I was a PhD student at Springfield, you know, begging for money was actually something I did have experience with, working at Bally Total Fitness before coming to UConn.
Yeah, I was doing that too, yeah.
So I knew how to sell. And talk to people, but you know, the ethics of the sales business sometimes was the thing that kind of got me, right? You're selling somebody something maybe they can't afford, or, you know, those kind of things really bother me. So, but the skill of being able to talk to people and try to convey what the ask was really important. But I can remember, you know, just my mother and my father were really supportive of me in my PhD, where we didn't have enough money at Springfield to run the assays needed to defend my dissertation. And so I'll never forget this, where I ended up finding the money where the university at the end of the fiscal year had some extra cash and they reimbursed me. But like I'll never forget this. My mother pulled out her credit card and dropped $3,000 on these assays, so we can get this done. And eventually the university was able to reimburse, but otherwise I was going to, you know, she was on the hook for some of that. And, you know, so the importance of having that. Now I had that option. Some people don't have that option. And so it's just the support structure, as you said, is super, super important. And I think in both of our cases, we've both been pretty successful. We've mentored students, and it's just, the field has, I think, benefited from the great work of having the both of us in the field. Not to talk too highly of ourselves, but we've really made the most of those experiences.
Yeah, going back to what you said earlier about the sales thing, I was just rubbish at sales. I had to do, you know, as a personal trainer, you're sort of selling yourself. I had to do gym membership sales. That was one of my first jobs, and I was just rubbish at it. You know, I'm a really shy, introverted person, and it scares me to death to go to somebody and try to sell them something. But for some reason, when it's education, I can happily stand in front of a room full of people. I'll be ecstatic to stand in front of a full room and give a lecture on anything. Even as a shy, introverted person, I like that. The idea of sharing education, if it's something that the crowd wants, you know, I'm absolutely ecstatic to give it. But I just can't do that sales stuff. I'm terrible at it.
I think to a certain degree, a lot of the guilt was selling people something that maybe they were interested in X, and then you sold them Y, Z, and then the next alphabet. Right. And what was good for the business and the organization wasn't necessarily the ideal alignment of what the person was looking for, right? And so it's I had opportunities to go to UConn, and I kind of saw that Bally Total Fitness's financial picture was struggling for some of that. So I made the decision to get out of the fitness sales business and the personal training business and really double down in the research career and dedicate myself to the career similar to you did. Along those lines, when you finished at UConn, one of the things that I think is really interesting, because I took the same path, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on it. You started out at Georgia Southern before going to Jacksonville, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so many people in our field, I guess, are by their mentors encouraged to go do a postdoc or the debate of whether you should just start in a faculty position. So you could talk a little bit about how you kind of like felt reassured, like, I think I'm ready to start faculty right away.
Yeah.
And I might not need that postdoc training. I feel like I got a good experience at UConn, and I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts as somebody else who maybe didn't do a postdoc and just jumped right into faculty, and it's worked out pretty well for you.
Yeah, so there was a slight diversion. Remember, I didn't finish at the University of Connecticut. Weirdly, I did the first 3 years of my PhD at UConn, and then Dr. Kramer was offered the job to go to Ohio State, and I actually spent 1 year, one wonderful year. I absolutely loved Ohio State. 1 year at Ohio State, so then they gave me the PhD, even though I was only there for 1 year. Mm-hmm. But even from the very beginning, Dr. Kramer would always encourage us to think about the sorts of positions that we were interested in. He would complain a lot. He was very honest, complaining about bringing in funding. And he was always afraid of not being able to fund us. He would be very honest. He would say, we work year to year. I have grants for next year, but the following year, I'm staying up at night worrying about, whether these next grants are coming in and whether I can fund you next year. So he would encourage us to think about whether or not that was a life that we wanted. And I was certain that it wasn't. Again, going back to being a bad salesperson, in my experience, and I'm not a good grant writer, but in my experience of grant writing or going after businesses, it's an awful lot like sales again. You're trying to sell yourself, you're trying to sell your lab to some organization that has grant opportunities or some panel, and it feels like sales again. And again, that's not what I'm good at. So I didn't think that I would be a good researcher. I loved being involved in research, but I didn't think that I could be the one who could go out there and get money and provide for a whole lab group the way that Dr. Kramer did. If I could be a career postdoc, I would do that. That would be awesome. I think those are the most fun responsibilities. Sure. Running studies, writing IRBs, designing studies, training a lab group, all of that stuff is great, but getting the money part is the hard part. And I knew it wasn't for me. So the postdoc really didn't make sense for me. Dr. Kramer would call a postdoc a holding cell. It's a temporary position, obviously, in its nature, as you wait for something else. There has to be some sort of a purpose to it, whether it be to learn a really specific skill under a specific researcher, because that's an area of research you want to go into. But again, I had already made the decision that my talent really was teaching. It wasn't research. And so going to a smaller, non-research-based university was always going to be my goal. Weirdly, even though that was my goal, and I could not have asked for a better graduate school experience, I couldn't have asked for a better advisor. He was the one that I wanted. He was the one I got. I couldn't have gotten a better advisor. But weirdly, it worked against me a little bit, because my goal was to go to a teaching institution. And when I was interviewing for jobs, they would ask about my teaching. And I think that they were concerned as to whether or not it was a position that I really wanted. Was I just applying for jobs? Were these essentially safety schools because I was applying for jobs at larger research universities that I was hoping to get? And I sort of had to convince them, no, this is what I want to do. Despite my research experience, this is what I want to do. And then it also hurt me a little bit because our primary job was running research studies. It wasn't teaching. I would fill in a guest lecture every now and again, but I had never actually taught a class. I had never written a syllabus and taught for a whole semester. I had never done that. And so I had to convince these schools that I could do it. Now, as you know, the classic academic interview includes a teaching demonstration. And for the most part, if you can give a good talk, people will have faith that, okay, this guy can teach. So I had to go in there and convince these schools that I could teach. So the postdoc was never something that I was considering. It never fit me. It was a challenge for me, though, to convince these schools that I could teach and that that's what I wanted to do. And Georgia Southern, at the time it was called Armstrong State University, now called Georgia Southern at Armstrong, was again one of these balanced schools. The position was a really nice fit for me. They had a lab, they had research opportunities, but the predominant responsibility was teaching. So it was a really, really good position for me. I couldn't have asked for more from the position. So then obviously you wonder, well, why did I leave after 2 years? That name change was significant. Georgia Southern, essentially, they called it a merger, but at Armstrong, we were calling it a takeover. Georgia Southern, Armstrong merged with Georgia Southern, and Georgia Southern proper in Statesboro has kinesiology. And the one in Savannah, just an hour down the road, has kinesiology. And I was convinced that if this merger went through, which it did, that this department would one day become one, two would become one. And I was convinced that that would happen at Statesboro, which would involve me relocating anyway. And I was very concerned about the uncertainty of that merger and whether or not my department was either going to exist. And my number one place to live in America, believe it or not, I had done a lot of research. I really, really wanted to be in Jacksonville.
Gotcha.
Perfect. Of weather, of cost, of exactly where I wanted to live if I could get a job in Jacksonville. And a job came up that year, so I applied for it and thankfully got it. Now, as it turns out, the merge, they did keep these two departments separate at Georgia Southern. So I was essentially worried about nothing. But I still got essentially my dream job in Jacksonville out of it. So again, I got lost on a tangent again, didn't I? But the postdoc never made sense for me. It was never really something I considered.
Yeah, I completely agree for many of the same reasons, in terms of we came from very large research institutions. And so to a certain extent, if that's what the predominance of what you didn't have a lot of teaching experience, on paper, I guess, teaching a whole class and those types of things, there's concern. Well, like you said, is this sort of just a temporary backup plan to getting a larger research position? Which was actually one of the reasons why I had decided to not do my PhD at UConn. I sort of knew, very similar to yourself, that while I love the research enterprise and I wanted to be involved with what I'll call, manageable, smaller projects, low cost type projects with a lab and grow a culture, that, the competition and the not having the locus of control of getting the grant from places like the NIH and the timeline, you put so much time and effort into it, that pretty much if you get the grants, kind of like winning the lottery, even if you put together a fantastic idea, sometimes it's not even discussed. And much of what is reviewed is beyond your locus of control. So I knew Springfield was really good in the region at preparing faculty members for these types of positions right off the bat. So that's kind of what made me shift from UConn. I still kept the iron hot and still collaborated a lot and saw a lot of folks from UConn at New England ACSM and stayed in touch with Dr. Kramer and Dr. Pescatello all throughout my PhD. But so that was the reason why I pivoted, for many of the same reasons. Is I kind of felt like when you're part of a nationally, internationally reputable PhD program like UConn was, the sort of the dream team with everybody there all in one place, I felt like the research experiences we were getting in that environment were going to provide, not all, I want to be ignorant to all, but many of the skill sets that we would need to be successful as faculty members ourselves. And so adding on, like you said, a very specific skill in a postdoc position, I didn't really have anything in mind. And so to a similar degree, I think we're on the same page with that. I do want to talk a little bit, if we can shift gears a little bit, about some of the research and the work that you have been involved with in the realm of endocrine physiology. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is when we were at UConn, I used to see Dr. Kramer in the weight room, and he would always tell me, 6x6, and and then we have these ACSM guidelines of 8 to 10 exercises, 8 to 12 reps, 60 to 80% of the 1 rep max, and 2 to 4 sets, right? That's kind of the standard recommendation. So can you talk a little bit about your work in endocrine physiology? And, one of the things I'm hopeful that we can sort of, maybe once we address that, talk a little bit about, what is it about that recommendation of why that's recommended for public health from a physiological perspective, and thinking a little bit about, like, why, what's the reason why that is thought to be the sort of broad recommendation for most people?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot to talk about there. So my initial goal when I started graduate school at UConn is I'm a little bit of a strange Englishman in that I really loved baseball, and I came when I emigrated initially. I was in New Jersey for 2 years with my wife. That's where she grew up, and I became a big Yankee fan, and I absolutely loved watching the Yankees, and I became obsessed with baseball. And when I started my graduate school with Dr. Kramer, I really thought I was going to be a baseball strength and conditioning coach. I wanted to get my master's degree. I wanted to get some experience working with athletes and become a baseball strength and conditioning coach. I did not have any interest in endocrinology at all. In fact, I was hoping that throughout my master's, and then even though I decided very early on in my master's degree that I just loved the research process so much and that I wanted to commit to a PhD and I wanted to commit to academia, even though I made all those decisions, I wanted to get through my PhD some way, somehow, without having to study endocrinology, because I didn't like it, despite my advisor being, that being his specialty.
Yeah.
And then he essentially forced me, although it was an amazing opportunity, to write a paper early on in my PhD. He had been asked by somebody called Dr. Hackney from UNC Chapel Hill to write a book chapter, and he invited me to help put it together with him and Dr. Hackney, which was a huge opportunity. And I had to, for the first time, I had to really learn about endocrinology. And it always scared me because it just seems so complicated. It seems like such hardcore benchtop science that it just seemed beyond me. Again, I thought I was going to be a baseball strength and conditioning coach. This seemed like I wasn't smart enough for this. And when I wrote this chapter with those two absolutely brilliant endocrinology professors, Dr. Kramer, Dr. Hackney, I got it. I finally thought, man, this is really interesting stuff. And I just learned the basics of endocrinology by, as strange as it sounds, writing a paper. I learned a lot while writing the paper.
Sure.
I wrote about stuff I didn't know about until I wrote that paper. Until I wrote that chapter with them, and I finally thought that this stuff was going to be really interesting and worth studying. At the time, and probably still, Dr. Kramer would debate with another lab group as to whether or not the endocrine response to strength training is important. And there is a lab group that vehemently argues against its importance and has put out many papers that say it's totally irrelevant. Dr. Kramer is essentially the pioneer of strength training endocrinology, as in what happens to the hormones in response to strength training. That was his pioneering work, was documenting that. And now this lab group says, well, essentially it's not important. Without getting too much into that debate, I think that it is important. I think if the body decides to take an energetically expensive molecule like cholesterol, turn it into a hormone, and then send that around the body, but only at specific times, depending on the way that you design your strength training program, I think that is noteworthy and that is worth understanding. I don't think the body is making a mistake in doing it, so I think it would be naive to call it irrelevant. I think it is relevant. I don't think that it is necessary for you to design your workout programs in such a way to maximize the hormone response in order to get hypertrophy, because you can get hypertrophy from strength training programs that don't have any endocrine response at all. That is, really heavy weights and very long rest periods, that just won't get you much of an endocrine response. But you'll still grow and you'll still get a lot stronger. So again, without getting too much into the hardcore physiology debate, which I couldn't possibly finish here in this podcast.
Sure.
The initial idea of your classic hypertrophy programs came from that idea, which is maximize the volume, short rest periods, large muscle groups, and that will stimulate a major hormone response. And hormones such as testosterone will be flying around your bloodstream. And we know that testosterone is a very anabolic hormone. So the thought of that flying around our body is a nice thought. Sure. It also, coincidentally, is what a lot of bodybuilders do, right? High volume, short rest. And while you might think of bodybuilders as meatheads, there is no question that bodybuilders know how to grow muscle, right? And if that's what they're doing, then there must be some substance behind it. So that's where that initial programming came from, as far as I can tell. Again, I'm very young. All of this happened before my career. But it does seem that you can grow and get stronger really from any repetition range. You know, you can lift very heavy. That'll be good for your strength development. You can lift with long rest and you can still get bigger. You can do really light loads, and as long as you take them close to failure, then even a set of 30 can get you some muscle growth. And again, that's been well documented at this point. Personally, I have absolutely no interest in doing sets of 30. That just seems miserable to me. It's not like it doesn't hurt. It hurts. It just, you know, for the first half, you feel fine. And then the second half is pure misery, right? At the end of a set of 30. So I'd still rather be at the most in the 12 repetition range, but any of this stuff works. And whatever your personal preference is, then that's fine. I mean, I think that the biggest hurdle with exercise for most people is doing it. And if there is something that you like to do, then I would encourage you to make that the foundation of your strength training program, because it's hard enough, you know, getting the energy to work out and going putting yourself through all that discomfort. That's all hard enough. You might as well be doing what you would most like to be doing while you're in the weight room.
I love that response, because that's one of the things that we talk about is I think a lot of people know that exercise is good for you, but it's really hard to get people to do it.
Of course.
And so, you know, some of the things that are not necessarily in the vein of exercise science is, you know, some of the books that I've read are like, you know, The Power of Habit or Atomic Habits by James Clear. And how do you sort of bundle those behaviors to do something? And one of the things that I realize is the target is really important. So I think what you're saying is there's a lot of ways in which you can stimulate, you know, skeletal muscle hypertrophy as improving, I'll call it 2 of the 5 health related components of physical fitness, right? Strength and endurance. And one way is not necessarily wrong. They all stimulate the muscle, they stimulate a response, they facilitate a chronic adaptation over time. But I think in terms of what is ultimately going to get people to do it is sometimes a larger question, because unless people can somehow tether a goal or an outcome variable of interest. So, you know, people that go to the gym, you know, that maybe were athletes like ourselves, right? And we got into the field and start thinking about, well, you know, what's going to be the target? You know, I don't have an off-season strength program to go play for football anymore. You know, so do I want to go compete and do powerlifting competitions? You know, I have completely shifted out of that realm, by the way, and more in the realm of martial arts right now. So, you know, the belt system and, you know, working hard on the technique and the training and the flexibility so you can put your body in certain positions. So the target, I think, is important, to get people to do it. But as you said, the physiological stimulus of the work being done can achieve the same outcome depending upon how you manipulate sets, reps, weight, volume, rest period, et cetera. I think those are really important points, because sometimes I feel like people have this sort of thought process where things need to be ideal, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to go work out first of the year. I'm going to join the gym. I'm going to buy the new exercise equipment. I'm going to buy, I'm going to buy the squat rack behind David right now where it can fold it into the wall. And now I'm going to have every opportunity, I have everything set up, and it's going to be ideal. But in life, it's really not ideal, right? We're constantly trying, you're fitting a workout in first thing in the morning or late at night or the weekend, you got family obligations. And so I love how you took a very prescriptive sort of, you look at the guidelines and it says, these are the recommendations with the ranges, and not to look at it as a standalone recommendation you must sort of do this in order to get that there's a lot of ways to facilitate that same goal. And I love how you don't necessarily like commit to like bodybuilders, right? Like bodybuilders must be doing something. So if they're doing it and they're getting these kinds of results, there's likely a reason why they're doing it. And I without going into the sort of the debate about the benefit is a lot of my research is in exercise and appetite hormones. So endocrinology is sort of a thing. And I really interested in sort of the gut peptides and how we can use exercise to curb a person's perception to eat and overeat, and use it sort of from that realm of controlling appetite. But so it's just kind of interesting how there are a lot of ways in which we can accomplish this. But I guess sort of towards that realm, with the hormonal surge that occurs, there is actually a similar receptor in the growth hormone side of things, and where ghrelin and leptin bind in the ventromedial hypothalamus nearby the growth hormone receptors for appetite regulation. And, one of the things that I know that you're interested in with some of your work is the undernourishment and its effect on hormones for both men and women. And I think that's important just from if you could talk a little bit about it from a population standpoint, like not separating out by sex, and then, talking about it of what are the sex specific things that are important to consider. I think that would be good for folks to sort of understand, well, these are like the one size fits all expectations. But as we know, with a lot of research is, there's whole textbooks on the importance of sex differences in sport and how females and males respond and adapt to exercise. So can you talk a little bit about the undernourishing and its effect on hormones, and then maybe some sex specific stuff?
Yeah, I'd love to. So again, thought I was going to be a baseball strength and conditioning coach. Then we started to study endocrinology, strength training. And then at the time, Dr. Kraemer was heavily debating the lab group from McMaster, headed by Dr. Stu Phillips, who was arguing against the importance of the endocrine response to strength training. He still continues to argue heavily against it. So when it came to dissertation time, we sort of had two choices. One choice was to do some work in that area and try to illustrate what we felt the importance of the endocrine response to strength training was. That was one option. And then option number two, going back to that paper that I wrote, the chapter that I wrote with Dr. Hackney and Dr. Kraemer, Dr. Hackney's area of expertise was testosterone reduction in highly active populations. So those were my two choices. It seemed that the cheaper, easier, less complicated one to do was going to be the low energy, high active, low testosterone stuff with Dr. Hackney. So that's the route that we decided to go. So very strangely, I started out graduate school thinking I was going to be a baseball strength and conditioning coach. And now that couldn't be a more anaerobic strength power event, right? Baseball. And now my dissertation is actually going to end up being essentially on distance runners, marathon runners. So, it couldn't be a more opposite type of athlete. At first, I definitely wasn't interested in it. But the more that I read about it, the more application of it I saw to everybody. And although it's been predominantly studied in distance runners, it's probably been predominantly studied in distance runners because that's the most obvious place to start. If you want a highly active population, then go with endurance athletes. If you want to see if something happens when somebody is super active, go to them. However, it has been documented even in American football players, and you can't get more testosterone strength power than American football, and low testosterone absolutely exists in that population too. It basically just occurs when there is a combination of very high amounts of physical activity, for whatever reason, you're not supporting that physical activity with your food intake, or maybe even your food intake is fine and still the testosterone drops, but for whatever reason, the sex hormones drop. Now, this happens in both men and women. It is the only area of exercise science that I am aware of that has been more studied in women than men. So I am certainly not complaining about it, right? We always default to men in all areas of exercise science, except this one. So I'm not complaining about it. But it's been very well studied in women for generations. In women, it's classically known as the female athlete triad.
Yes.
Some people now try to say that there is a new term for the female athlete triad, and they say that it's REDS. The female athlete triad community hates that, and they do not want it to now be called REDS because they don't believe it's the same thing. So it's not really the new name for the triad. It's a new group of scientists talking about very much the same stuff, but the triad folk do not like now just calling it REDS instead.
Gotcha.
But anyway, the idea is the classic female athlete triad is if you undereat, you will see a loss of the menstrual cycle. Whether you have an eating disorder or not, an eating disorder can be involved in it, but for whatever reason, the athlete is undereating, they lose the menstrual cycle. The loss of the menstrual cycle itself, and this is where it gets weird, right? It gets dangerous for me to be here mansplaining periods, right? Here's a guy talking about periods, but it is what it is.
Sure.
I assume for a woman, I've asked my wife if this is true, and she confirms that it would actually be kind of nice not to have the menstrual cycle and not have to worry about that every month. The problem, the loss of the menstrual cycle in and of itself, not that big of a deal, but the loss of the menstrual cycle is a barometer for your hormone health. It is telling you that there is some hormonal dysfunction, and that is the concern. Estrogen has reduced to the point where your body has decided, for whatever reason, you're not eating enough to support you, so you're not eating enough to support another life. And so essentially, we're going to make you temporarily infertile and the menstrual cycle stops. The problem with all of this is, now again, if you're a competitive athlete, maybe this sounds like a good thing. Like if I can be temporarily infertile, it's essentially birth control. I wasn't really looking to start a family right now. This could be a good thing. But again, the concern is that estrogen is bone protective. And so if you have low estrogen, it isn't protecting your bone. And this is when it becomes a big deal. If your bone mineral density drops, it becomes a massive concern now, because it could make you prone to stress reactions and stress fractures. Now, if you are a collegiate athlete, if you have a stress fracture, and for whatever reason, the part of the body that is most prone to low bone density is the lower spine, the lumbar spine. So if you get a stress fracture in your lumbar spine, your athletic trainer is probably going to tell you that you have to do nothing until it recovers. It's the lower spine. You can't do upper body. You can't do lower body. You have to do nothing until this heals. If you're a competitive athlete and you have to do nothing for, say, 2 to 3 months while it heals, your season is gone. Even if it happens right at the beginning of the season and you're in mid-season by the time you're back, it's going to take you another 2 months to get your strength and fitness back, and you're just done. You're done for the whole season. So in the short term, it's a major problem. You could lose a season very quickly to a stress fracture. And then in the long term, it's an even bigger deal. Forget just right now competing as an athlete. Think about it as you move into your later life. If you have brittle bones in your 50s and 60s, not to get too hyperbolic, if you fall in your 50s and 60s and you get a fracture in your hip, indirectly that can kill you. The hip fracture itself doesn't kill you, but the inactivity that follows the hip fracture can essentially lead to your death. As crazy as that sounds, hip fractures kill people. So this low bone density issue is a really big deal and should not be ignored. So it's been very, very well studied in women. One of the reasons why it's probably been better studied in women is because you have this absence of the menstrual cycle. If a woman doesn't get her menstrual cycle, it's an obvious thing that hasn't come, right? Like that is supposed to be here. It's not here. So you're very likely to go to the doctor and say, what's going on? Why aren't I getting my period? Or you might freak out at first and think, oh my God, I'm pregnant. And then when you find out you're not pregnant, well, then why aren't I getting my menstrual cycle? And then you start trying to fix it, hopefully. On the other hand, all of this stuff absolutely happens in men. The problem for the man, to some extent, is we don't have the menstrual cycle, so we don't have this conspicuous event that tells us something is wrong. What happens to the man is the stuff that you probably don't want to talk about, which is if you have low testosterone and you start getting symptoms of hypogonadism, it's the stuff that no man wants to talk about, let alone a young athletic man, being stuff like erectile dysfunction, right? Reduced libido. Young men traditionally don't want to talk about this. What are the chances that they're going to go to their doctor and say, doctor, I can't get an erection. What's wrong with me? So that would probably be one of the predominant reasons why it's been less studied in men, but it's all still happening. No, the estrogen isn't a problem, but the low testosterone is also linked with the low bone density, just as it is with women. And the problem with bone is that it is a completely hidden disease. You have no idea, unless you get a DEXA scan, what your bone density is.
Exactly.
Most people have no idea, even athletic populations, no idea. And the only way, the most likely way that you're going to find out that you have low bone density is that you get a stress fracture. And now the doctor says, wow, you're getting stress fractures. You must have low bone density. Let's go check your bone density. And then you find out, oh God, I have low bone density. But at that point, It's too late. This whole thing should have been prevented in the first place, right? And so the nice thing about this area that I really like studying is it's a big deal, right? First and foremost, it's a big deal, not just for athletic performance, but for long-term life. It absolutely applies to men and women. It's a sport nutrition issue, just a basic sport nutrition issue. We got to try to get them to eat more. And then the solution to low bone density is something that I love too, which is heavy strength training, particularly on the spine. So we love squats, we love deadlifts, we love Olympic lifts, and we like heavy lifting to try to improve bone density. So it actually turns out to be this really cool area that brings all of these sports, all of these athletes, and all these areas that I'm interested in, nutrition, strength training, and sport, brings them all together. So it actually becomes a really awesome thing to study.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of great points, and I really like how you outline the whole process of, this is not just something that affects women. This is something that also affects men. You just don't have the signs as obvious as you would with women. So, and that oftentimes, we hear about this. I talk about this for folks with osteopenia and porosis is, a lot of times your hormones you go year to year for a physical and your calcium levels look good. And little do you know that slowly over time from the undernourishment that your brain is going to adjust to keep you in that homeostatic set point. And it's going to resorb that bone over years and years and years. And so you go for a routine lab test, it's not going to show up, like you said, unless you have the stress fracture or unless you have a DEXA scan. And, we're fortunate enough to have one here at Drexel in Philadelphia, and we do some of the work with some of the pro teams that people would recognize. But it's only when you get those scans where you start to see, hey, well, bone mineral density is a little lower than what would be expected. You're 2.5 standard deviations below the mean here. And this is significant. This is a significant problem that we need to resolve. So, I think it's a very big issue, and I'm glad that you're on the sort of the front lines working through it with some of your work. And it's something that, I think I've heard about RED-S as well. And we had Dr. George Brooks, his wife Rosalie Agostini, who is sort of the pioneer who sort of termed the female athlete triad back in the 1980s when it was first sort of coming through with the scientific research. She actually came and did the keynote lecture at Mid-Atlantic ACSM. Well, wow. George did the keynote, but she came as well and traveled and was participating in some of our sessions. So it's kind of interesting how, it's all coming full circle in a lot of ways. And the field is really so small, and definitely something that I think people need to keep an eye on for is making sure that they're eating a sufficient amount of calories and that they're getting the micronutrients as well as the macronutrients, and to make sure that you're doing resistance training to help, deter some of that T-spine issue. Or some people, they have low bone mineral densities, perhaps in the hip that we see, right? So depending on if you're doing the segmental scan or if you're doing a total body scan, sometimes you see stuff show up in some cases and not in other cases. So I think it's really good feedback and points of consideration.
Yeah. So in my previous institution, when I was at Armstrong, Georgia had a much looser law on DEXA scans, and you didn't have to be an X-ray tech to run the DEXA. Do you have to be in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania? I don't know.
So in Philadelphia, yeah, here the expectation is if you're going to use it for a clinical diagnostic purpose, you have to have the X-ray technician standard. Here, if you're using it for scientific research, which we do for our athlete study, or some of our other projects, you have to go through the university's biological training protocol for X-ray safety.
But you can do it, though.
So I could do it. Yeah, I run the scans for people.
Oh,
yeah,
good for you. So in the state of Florida, it's as far as I understand it, it's a lot more conservative, and you have to be a certified X-ray tech to run it here in Florida.
Yeah.
So anyway, in Georgia we could do it. In Florida I can't, and we don't have a DEXA either yet. Although I'm always working on getting one.
Yeah.
So in Georgia we would run them, and we had as an example to what you were talking about before, we had a decently competitive Ironman come into our lab and get a DEXA scan. We did a total body scan and we did the sectional scans. The total body scan came back normal. He had perfectly normal bone density. But it wasn't until you looked at his AP spine scan that you saw that that area of his spine was dangerously low.
Absolutely.
And so the extremity, the bone density in his extremities were masking the fact that he had this area. And again, it's the lower spine. What a terrible place to get a stress fracture, your lower spine. It's that area in particular that was low. And it was very important for us to run that scan, find that, and give him something to work on. Yeah. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known. He was sort of not to be too dramatic, but a ticking time bomb.
Sure.
And he would never have known.
Well, if you ever want to collaborate and you want to do stuff with DEXA, you let me know. We're a FAR, but we could do multi-center studies and those types of stuff. So
no question. I need help with DEXA.
We have DEXAs here, right down the same building I'm in right now. So if you ever come to Philadelphia, you could definitely come and visit. We'll show you the labs. And my brother lives in Florida. He's a little south than from where you're at, but I'll stop through and visit you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, and just good to build these discussions. But so I guess as we wrap things up, sort of as we close, what kind of advice do you give your students, and what kind of advice would you give maybe aspiring students who are watching this podcast on any like last minute advice in terms of just your perspective in the field and how they should move forward, and any advice you'd give them?
Well, I guess it's a little bit cheesy, but for me, it would just be follow your dreams, whatever they are. For me, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to study with one of the world's most foremost scientists in the area that I wanted to study. And I got this crazy idea to contact him and pursue studying with him. And some way, somehow it worked out. And it is truly unbelievable that it worked, and that I got to meet him, and that he got to take me on, and I got to study under him. And again, sounding a little bit cheesy, but all my dreams came true because of that. I didn't talk about this in the beginning, but I'm a working class boy. I came from a family without a history of academia. My sister was the first person in our family, in our extended family that I'm aware of, that ever went to university. So you would never have expected me to become an academic. There was no chance, really. And thankfully, I pursued it, and Dr. Kramer changed my life, and all of my dreams came true. And so if you have a goal, my goodness, go for it. As far as I'm concerned, we get one shot at life, and you should just throw everything that you have at your dreams, and they really might come true.
Beautiful. Well said, David. David, it's been such an honor to have you on the podcast. Where could people find you on social media so they can learn a little bit more about what you're doing and the kind of great work you've been up to?
Oh, yes. Please follow me on Instagram. I need all the help that I can get. I don't know how these people get 100,000 followers. I'm struggling along here. My handle is at David R. Hooper, PhD. I really didn't want to put the PhD in there, but David R. Hooper was already taken, so it was the only option I had. So David R. Hooper, PhD. Yes, please follow me and like and share my stuff. I need all the help I can get.
Absolutely. And if I'm already on it, I told you it's funny you post on Instagram and I find most of your stuff on Facebook, but we'll make sure to put that in the show notes so that way you can share it widely and give you some great exposure for the wonderful work that you're doing. So on behalf of us here at the Exercises Medicine podcast here at Drexel, Dr. David Hooper, thank you for taking the time and being here today. It's truly been an honor to reconnect with you and learn about the great work that you're doing.
Pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, David.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.